Bibliophiles of the internet, another month has come and gone, and so I am back to share my May wrap-up. I don't know why, but something inside me just snapped in May because I somehow read 14 books. There were definite highs and there were definite lows, so let's just get into it. The first book I finished in May was Kiss Me Maybe by Gabriela Gamez. Forever kindly sent me a review copy, and I also listened to an ALC provided by Libro FM, read by Ruby Corazon, and this one already came out on May 6th. This is a queer adult romance about a Latina librarian named Angela who has never been kissed, and she ends up going viral when she takes to TikTok and posts a confessional video about being both a late bloomer and also someone who identifies as ace. Suddenly, all these people online are very invested in helping her experience some of those firsts, and so she comes up with this idea to create a scavenger hunt of sorts in her hometown, and whoever solves all the clues first will get to be her first kiss. And of course, to pull this off, she enlists the help of a hot local bartender who she's been secretly crushing on for years. Content warnings for experienced bullying, homophobia, and acephobia, explorations of online harassment and violations of privacy, and some explicit sexual content. Also worth noting, the love interest I believe is bisexual, and the main character, like I said, is aspec and sapphic. I'm gonna try to keep this brief because unfortunately there just wasn't much that I liked about this, and what makes it all the more disappointing for me is that in theory, on paper, this should absolutely be my kind of romance. And while there were things about it that I can certainly appreciate, overall I just found that it majorly misses the mark. Firstly, the plot point that initially drew me into the story, this epic romantic scavenger hunt, which could have been so much fun, is something that almost immediately gets written off. It's a huge misnomer, it's a big red herring. It's the catalyst of the story, but it's not the narrative centerpiece that the story really needs. It's painfully obvious from the beginning that Angelica and Crystal are pining for each other, which on the one hand is the point, but also takes away from any tension in the story, any question that Angelica might discover some new prospects throughout this scavenger hunt process. The other off-putting part of this story, for me, is both a pro and a con in some ways. It's the fact that the characters talk so much about their relationship, which is actually a non-relationship for a majority of the book, and their emotions in theory, which makes them feel less like fully realized characters and more like mouthpieces or soapboxes. On the one hand, I respect this story for making space for the characters to have in-depth conversations about their identities, their relationship to sex and sexuality, the nature of the relationship developing between them. Especially when it comes to ace identities and microlabels, we don't really get to see that level of discourse and nuance afforded to exploring aceness. So that's something I actually respect and value about the story, but at the same time, those conversations don't always feel organic. They end up feeling textbook, they feel somewhat detached, and the characters' relationships, both to each other and to themselves, end up feeling more like an intellectual exercise rather than an organic relationship rooted in undeniably genuine emotion. And I also found it somewhat troubling that the main characters ascribe a very strange and strict hierarchy, both moral and mental, over aspects of their sexual relationship. Like, they're very set on quote-unquote preserving the sanctity of Angela's first kiss, but then they have no qualms about engaging in other sexual practices. And as a demisexual myself, I just found it very hard to keep track of these conflicting and perplexing rules. So ultimately, this story just did not vibe with me. I think it was a fun concept, and again, I do appreciate that the story makes space to explore the spectrum of aceness, but besides that, a majority of the story ended up feeling very surface level and one note. So for those reasons, I can only give it 2 stars. On a much better note, after that I listened to Up in Smoke by Nick Brooks. Fierce Reads kindly sent me a finished copy, and I listened to an ALC provided by Macmillan Audio, which was read by Megan Souza and Aubrey Joseph, and this also came out on May 6th. This is a YA mystery/thriller about a young black teenager named Cooper who's pressured by his friends to go on a looting spree using a local Black Lives Matter protest as cover. However, while they're pulling this off, gunshots go off at the protest and someone ends up dead. Afterwards, the local news starts showing 4 masked teenagers near the scene of the crime, declaring them to be the suspects in this ongoing murder case, and those suspects are of course none other than Cooper and his friends. Then one of those friends, Jason, is actually arrested, and now it's up to Cooper and Jason's sister Monique, who happens to be Cooper's longtime crush, to find a way to clear Jason's name, and by extension, clear Cooper's name in the process. Content warnings for depictions of police brutality and police shootings, explorations of systemic racism and anti-Black Black violence, brief references to parental death and grief, instances of violence, assault, and injury, and some depictions of gun violence. When I read Nick Brooks' debut novel, Promise Boys, I knew that he was destined to become a powerful new voice in the YA space, and I think Up in Smoke only further solidifies that fact. If you've ever had the chance to hear Nick speak, you know that he's incredibly personable, charismatic, and passionate. He has this earnestness, this energy that's so infectious, and that same energy and magnetic presence absolutely comes through in his books. While the story does ask the reader to suspend a little bit of belief as these two teenagers put their lives on the line again and again in order to investigate this shooting on their own, it also resonates for that same exact reason. It's giving these two Black teenagers agency to actively fight back against injustice and also fight for themselves, which is a kind of agency and opportunity that so many Black kids are not actually afforded in real life. I also respect how there's a complex moral struggle at the center of the story, especially considering that Cooper is actively acting as an accessory to crime when the story begins. But the story isn't interested in condemning Cooper or his friends for the choices they've made, but rather attempts to give the reader the full context of these characters to show that people can't easily be slotted into these clear-cut boxes of good and bad with absolutely no overlap between the two. The truth is actually far more complex. It's a story that's showing young audiences especially that even though we are not defined by the choices we make, our choices do have consequences. And at the same time, we also have the capacity to learn from those choices and make different choices going forward. I think this story puts a refreshing spin on the YA thriller genre. It's action-packed and intense, but also tempered by moments of tenderness and even slow burn romance. I will definitely be reading whatever Nick Brooks writes next, and I gave this a solid 4 stars. After that, I read my arc of Brighter Than Scale, Swifter Than Flame by Neon Yang. This also happened to come out on May 6th, and I was sent a review copy courtesy of Tor.com. This is a queer fantasy novella pitched as The Mandalorian meets the Asian-inspired epic fantasy of She Who Became the Sun. The main character, Yeva, has trained to become a legendary guild knight, aka someone who hunts dragons, and she is so fully devoted to her sacred duty that she refuses to remove her armor in public. One day, she is assigned to a reclusive kingdom where dragons are not feared, but rather worshipped, and her mission is to covertly investigate whether there's any truth behind the rumors that this kingdom is secretly harboring a dangerous dragon behind its borders. Content warnings for some graphic violence and injury, some experienced racism and xenophobia, some depictions of chronic illness and chronic pain, references to parental death and grief, and some sexual content. Neon Yang just writes badass SFF stories. There are some people in this world who are just fucking cool and have incredibly cool fucking minds, and when they invite us into their imaginations, we can't help but feel cool by association. And that's what reading this book feels like. I feel like this story actually makes a lot of sense as a novella. Sometimes we read novellas and feel like we got cheated out of something that could have or should have been a full-length novel, and while of course I would have happily read hundreds of pages set in this fantasy world, I feel like it didn't need to be any more or less than what it was. And I love how the story is exploring how the concept of duty can be ascribed to so many different things. We might feel a sense of duty to our country, our family, our culture, our history, so how then do we parse out which people or institutions are actually worthy of our loyalty and commitment? That's what Yeva is really navigating in this story. She's been told her entire life that because she has this incredibly rare ability that she owes her allegiance to the Empire, that it's her responsibility to use that ability in a way that benefits and protects the Empire. And now that she's in a completely new environment and culture that has completely different values, she finally has space to question those ideas. Ultimately, this story is grappling with the concepts of loyalty and allegiance, which can be incredibly noble and respectable moral pillars to have, but we also have to understand their boundaries and their limitations. I really appreciate this story asking those questions, and while I think the relationship between characters could have been even stronger and better developed, I still had a great time reading this and would give it 4 stars. After that, I actually made another author taste test reading vlog where I read I Keep My Exoskeletons to Myself and A Sharp Endless Need, 2 sensational queer books, both by Marissa Crane. I was very thorough with my thoughts on both books in that video, so I will link it down below in case you would like to watch. Next, I picked up the audiobook for The Duke Stills Hearts and Other Body Parts by Elias Cold. Page Street Teen kindly sent me a review copy and I listened to the audiobook courtesy of PRH Audio, which is read by M. Grossland. And this also recently came out on May 13th. This is a strange little queer historical fantasy story about a young trans boy who has the ability to remove people's body parts with magic. And as a self-proclaimed con artist, he uses this magic to make a living by stealing people's body parts and then ransoming them back for a handsome fee. One day, the mark he's targeting claims that he can't actually pay the ransom for his stolen nose because his sister was the sole breadwinner of the family and she has recently gone missing. So Philip, the main character, decides to disguise himself as a duke so that he can interrogate the nobility and help figure out what happened to this missing sister. And in the process, he not only begins to fall for the missing sister, but also stumbles upon a much darker plot involving not just one, but several abducted girls. Content warnings for depictions of death, experience, transphobia, dead naming, and misgendering, some references to physical abuse and assault, some depictions of alcohol abuse, and some descriptions of blood, gore, and thematic violence. Like I said, this is such a bizarrely charming historical fantasy story that has so many interesting, macabre elements and sensibilities. It's dark, but it's quirky, and I think it perfectly appeals to a very specific niche that I happen to be a part of. On a surface level, the story is incredibly entertaining. There's crime, deceit, mystery, masquerading among the nobles, and weirdly specific kinds of bodily and necromantic magic that are surprising in this kind of historical setting, and yet never once feel out of place. And because the main character, Philip, is a self-proclaimed con artist who uses this somewhat disturbing magical ability to his own ends, the story is also highlighting how trans youth especially often have to make gruesome, or at the very least difficult choices in order to survive. And their personhood and their inherent value as people does not begin or end with those choices. Because Philip is also caught between trying to understand his gender and trying to understand his magic in real time as the story progresses, we also see him burning a lot of bridges, leaving a lot of people behind, and playing his cards incredibly close to the chest, again because he feels like that's the only way he can survive. And what I really appreciate about that is that the story is able to bring those ideas full circle and ultimately show Philip learning how to bring the truth of himself into everything he does, and learning how to give people the chance to meet him where he is rather than cutting them off before they get a chance to decide how they feel about him for themselves. Especially for younger readers, I think that's an incredibly nuanced and beautiful message, and I love how the story centers a character who is learning to find validation in his truth and in himself rather than in contorting himself to perform to or fit into other people's ideals. We may not be able to control how other people see us or perceive us, but we can control the way we show up in the world, the way we show up for other people, and the way we show up for ourselves. And all we can do is hope that people will meet our truth with their own truth. That is barely scratching the surface of everything this story has to offer, but I had a really great time listening to it. Definitely recommend the audiobook as well because M. Grosslin gives another tremendous performance. In the end, I gave this 4 stars. After that, I picked up my Patreon pick for the month, which was Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant by Curtis Chin. I was sent a finished copy by Little Brown, but I checked out the audiobook from my library, which is read by the author himself. Curtis Chin is a queer Chinese-American activist and documentary director. He grew up during the 1980s in Detroit, where, as you might guess, his parents owned and operated a Chinese restaurant. This memoir is basically cataloging what it was like for him to grow up working in that restaurant and what his parents' restaurant taught him about his queerness, his identity as an ABC, American-born Chinese, and also just how much he had to offer to the world, to his family, and also to himself. Content warnings for experienced racism and homophobia, some internalized fat phobia, reported use of racial and homophobic slurs, descriptions of anti-blackness, police violence, race riots, and racist hate crimes, and some sexual content. You know, I enjoyed this overall and absolutely appreciate what it brings to the table, but at the same time, I will say that I don't think it's bringing anything especially groundbreaking or innovative to the memoir space, which is totally fine. I think it's slightly above average. I think it's par for the course, but if someone asked me to recommend them a memoir, I'm not sure it would be the first one to come to mind. But I do really love how this memoir is structured because it's broken up into sections inspired by the different sections you would find on a restaurant menu, appetizers, soups, entrees, etc. And the more substantial the dishes in those sections become, the more substantial each respective essay becomes. So I found that to be a very clever framing device. And I love how this memoir truly honors the duality that comes with growing up as a queer immigrant of color in the States. Growing up in his family's restaurant, Curtis learned how to hide himself and closet himself, but he also learned how to liberate himself. He learned how to resent and reject his culture, but he also learned how to respect his culture's beauty and richness. This memoir does a great job of depicting that intersectionality and showing what it means to grow up in a country and a culture that ultimately rewards you for hating yourself and hating the things that are true about yourself, and what it means to instead find power in those very same things. That said, I did find the writing style and voice to be fairly simplistic, which again is totally fine. Not every piece of nonfiction has to be this elaborate, flowery masterpiece. Sometimes you just need to tell a story straight, no pun intended, to get the point across. But at the same time, because so many of these recollections read as fairly surface level and they're also pieced together in a way that feels somewhat disjointed, I don't think the overly simplistic writing did the memoir any favors, if that makes sense. So again, I did enjoy my time listening to this, and I'm glad I finally got a chance to read it, but I also think it clearly could have been stronger in some ways. So ultimately, I gave this 3.5 stars. The next book I picked up was My E-Galley of Bochica by Carolina Flores Cerciaro. This also recently came out from Primero Sonio Press on May 13th, and I listened to the audiobook read by Cynthia Farrell and Frankie Corzo. This is a Latin Gothic horror story set in Colombia during the 1920s. It's following Antonia and her father, who was once a renowned architect who designed and built a huge mansion for his family near a famous waterfall, but they quickly found themselves haunted by a malevolent spirit, and it all culminates in the tragic death of Antonia's mother, who appeared to have died by suicide. Years later, they've sold off the mansion and it's been converted into an opulent hotel, and when Antonia and her father are invited back for the hotel's grand opening, neither can resist the promise of finally facing down their demons and potentially figuring out the truth behind the mother's death. Content warnings for explorations of parental death and grief, allusions to suicide and suicidal thoughts, some experienced sexism and misogyny, descriptions of night terrors and other traumatic responses, and some descriptions of death, blood, injury, and violence. Listen, if Frankie Corzo is reading a book, you are gonna have a good time. And truthfully, I did enjoy listening to this, and I think it's a solid new entry in the gothic horror space. Where the story truly excels is in its thematic work, in the way the stakes of the story are inherently tied to the tension between the concepts of colonialist land ownership and land stewardship conducted by communities indigenous to the land itself. That's where the horror in this story stems from, the fact that people who are not of the land, including Antonia's family, are trying to exact ownership and control over it, who think they know what's best for the land and feel that they're entitled to make those choices because they've bought the land, even though they do not and cannot understand the full breadth of the land's histories, intricacies, and nuances. That unwelcome disruption, that discomfort between colonizing land and nurturing land is what's truly haunting the characters. That said, while I do really respect and appreciate what the story is doing thematically and also aesthetically, I found myself wanting more from the relationship dynamics. I think Antonia herself is very strongly characterized, but I found her relationships with other people to be a bit flat. On a structural note, Antonia is also uncovering these hidden journal entries written by her mom, which are helping to point her towards the truth of what really happened with the mansion and also the truth behind her own death. But I wish the story took even more advantage of those journal entries because they were a really compelling plot device, and ultimately we only get to read maybe 2 or 3 entries by the end. So that felt like a real missed opportunity, and I also think because the story takes place across an accelerated timeline of maybe 2 days, that also makes everything feel kind of rushed, and it doesn't give the revelations time to fully land. I just think if this was maybe 50 to 100 pages longer, it could have pulled off everything it was trying to accomplish. But in the end, I still gave this a solid 3.5 stars. Then from my local library, I checked out Lost Ark Dreaming by Suyi Davies Okumbawa. This is a really cool novella that blends together speculative fiction, dystopia, mystery, and even a little bit of horror. It's set in a futuristic version of West Africa where rising sea levels have overtaken most cities. So now the majority of the population live in these huge high towers that are partially submerged in water, and the wealthier you are, the higher up you get to live. And the story is following 3 of the tower's employees who are forced to work together when they're alerted to a potential breach in the tower's lower floors. Content warnings for experienced classism, descriptions of graphic injury and blood, and some depictions of violence. This little novella absolutely rocked my world and blew my mind. I have to give big props to Tori from Tori Morrow for constantly talking up this book and putting it on my radar to begin with because it truly fucked me up in the best possible way. I love how the story so seamlessly blends blends together all these different genres that just make sense and really lend themselves to what the story is trying to accomplish. I could not tear myself away from this book. It's intense, it's enthralling, it's dark, it's bleak, but it has to be in order to shed light on the equally bleak reality of how capitalism not only feeds into but thrives off of this pervasive every person for themselves mentality. The story makes this hierarchy between the haves and have-nots into a reality where those with the most resources, privilege, and power are literally above those who don't have those things, and where the lower class is literally closer to death than the higher classes. So the hierarchical nature of this tower acts not only as a mentally evocative visual, but as an incredibly clear and effective metaphor for how the upper classes are comfortable with putting other people's lives on the line if it means preserving their privilege and their comfort. And I think the story is able to very subtly draw out that commentary because it forces three characters together who not only live on vastly different levels, but also have completely different backgrounds and relationships to this tower structure. And they also have different levels of allegiance to maintaining that structure. And ultimately, by venturing down to the lower levels and potentially facing a deadly threat, the three of them are forced to confront the fact that their allegiance to this tower, the work they do to preserve it and keep it running, will not save them in the end. And not only that, but they're also uncovering these dark secrets about the tower and its surroundings that the higher-ups do not want the citizens to know, because if they discover the truth, the hold of the higher class becomes much more tenuous. Through this action-packed, suspenseful, edge-of-your-seat plot, I love how the story is able to explore how we are called not just to live for ourselves, but to find a way forward for all of us. By staying silent, by doing nothing, by upholding the status quo, we validate the death and suffering of those who have less privilege and protection than us. We validate that we are willing to pay the price of other people's lives and suffering in exchange for our own comfort. But ultimately, our allegiance is not and cannot be to the system itself, but rather to each other. The story is showing how we can't continue to condemn ourselves to living within the limited imagination of the few, but rather how we have to be brave enough to not only imagine, but forge new and unprecedented futures for everyone. This was fantastic. I cannot co-sign it and recommend it highly enough. Originally, I think I gave it 4.5 stars, but it might actually be 5 stars. Then I listened to my ALC of Salvación by Sandra Proudman, which also recently came out from Wednesday Books on May 20th. Macmillan Audio granted me access to the audiobook, which is read by Victoria Villarreal. This is a Latine YA fantasy story that gender bends the legend of Zorro. It's set in historical Alta California and follows a young Mexican girl named Lola who spends her days pretending to be a proper young lady who helps her mother cure the sick with a magical element known as black salt. But by night, she masquerades as a free-spirited vigilante known only as Salvación, protecting the town from those who threaten its peace, including a dangerous outsider threatening the town with Sal Roja, a magical element antithetical to Sal Negra that destroys rather than heals. Content warnings for depictions of blood, injury, and violence, experience misogyny and sexism, and some explorations of loss and grief. What I really love about this gender-bent reimagining is that it's actively fighting against the isolated, jaded vigilante trope. So many vigilante stories are about experiences of intense isolation, having to hide their double life, constantly living in fear of someone discovering their secret, keeping their distance from other people so as not to implicate other people in their vigilante activities. But Salvación is actually about a vigilante who can only exist because of the power of community and togetherness. This larger-than-life figure of Salvación actually does not and cannot exist on her own. She not only requires the cooperation and trust of the community, but also relies on the assistance of her brother and even her parents sometimes to pull off everything that she does. I really love that touch because it shows that Salvación is a strong, fierce, independent vigilante, but she's only able to be strong because she has so many people in her life who believe in her and support her pursuit of justice, or at the very least, are not going to stand in her way. I also found the fantasy elements of the story to be especially fascinating because Sal Negro and Sal Rojo seem to be magical counterparts that either heal or destroy respectively. And I thought the way both were used in the story actually reveals an incredibly relevant and pressing moral quandary because Sal Rojo destroys very rapidly, which speaks to how destruction, despair, and harm seem to spread so much faster and further than their counterparts of healing, love, truth, and hope. So the story is really asking what it means to pursue justice and liberation in a world where corruption is so prevalent and so powerful. How do we find strength and how do we ground ourselves in a way that's sustainable and allows us to continue fighting back? And as with any good Zorro story, I think it also opens up questions about how we perceive and define our concepts of good and evil. Salvacion is a figure of justice, but the irony, of course, is that she has to break the law as a vigilante in order to exact that justice. As the story unfolds, it's asking how far she's willing to go in order to achieve that sense of justice. Is justice truly worth any cost if it means hurting ourselves and others, destroying things, endangering people and land, and potentially having to employ the enemy's very same tools and weapons? These are big questions and interesting moral quandaries, and I appreciate how the story gives Lola space to explore them in her own time. While I think the relationships Lola has with people outside of her family could have been better developed, and while the story's villain does feel a bit mustache twirly at times, overall I appreciate what the story is doing, and I look forward to seeing what this author writes next. I gave this 4 stars. After that, I finally picked up Twelfth Night by Alexine Farrell Fulmuth, who also writes adult books under the pen name Olivia Blake. This one's been out for a bit, but I was sent an e-galley from Tor Teen. This is a contemporary YA romance that is obviously a modern twist on the Shakespeare classic. It's following 2 high schoolers, Jack and Viola, who are student body president and vice president, respectively. Jack is the typical golden boy, ultra-popular jock, while Vi is the prickly, introverted, super geeky type, and they're more often at each other's throats than they are on the same page. When Jack injures himself and finds himself sidelined for the rest of the school year, he takes up this MMORPG called Twelfth Night to pass the time, which just so happens to be Vi's favorite online game. They end up crossing paths in the game, Vi knowing that it's Jack from his screen name, but him not knowing that it's her because she's playing as a guy, and they realize they actually make a pretty good team in the game, even if they can't figure out how to work together in real life. Content warnings for descriptions of graphic injury, experienced sexism and misogyny, and some instances of both online and in-person sexual harassment. Truthfully, I didn't know what to expect going into this, but I absolutely adored this book. It was such a freaking delight and a pleasant surprise in so many ways. Stylistically, this book took me back to the books I loved reading as a teenager myself, especially things like The Princess Diaries, because it has all those same elements and touchstones that made reading those books so much fun, like an undeniably distinctive first-person voice, a narrative style bordering on confessional, cutting witticism, a mile-a-minute banter, and most importantly, a ton of heart. I also love that this story is such an entertaining and refreshingly modern spin on a Shakespeare classic. I feel like it very lovingly pays homage to the source material, especially with all the different romantic entanglements and confusion, but at the same time, it's not afraid to branch out in its own directions and explore questions and themes that will definitely resonate with modern-day teenagers in regards to the modern-day issues and concerns they face. Vi and Jack are both incredibly strong characters who know themselves and know what they believe in, and because of that, I think the story is able to explore what it means to unapologetically be yourself, and also not be afraid to show up for yourself when other people can't or won't. You definitely see that with Violet especially, because she is incredibly strong-willed and self-reliant. She's used to people writing her off as too uptight, too serious, too much, but she doesn't let people's ungenerous opinions of her stop her from being herself. But there's also nuance to that characterization, because yes, Violet should be herself. She should be uncompromising when it comes to the things that matter and the things she believes in. She should be unafraid to hold her own, but she also needs to learn that there's a very fine line between self-preservation and willful isolation. At what point is she weaponizing her autonomy as a means to isolate herself? I love that the story is asking that question and showing how even though it can be so terrifying to bear the truth of yourself to other people, you can absolutely let other people in without sacrificing your independence. Ultimately, this story is a humorous, entertaining, zany comedy of errors, but it also allows the characters to be deeply vulnerable and emotional with each other and also with themselves, and gives them space to grow without sacrificing who they truly are, which is an incredibly difficult line to walk. I do think because the story has such a huge cast of supporting characters, sometimes those branching storylines get left behind or forgotten until the very end when they have to be resolved, but that's a very minor note. This is definitely a new favorite for me, and I gave it 4.5 stars. I can now officially say that I've read every novel A.M. McLemore has ever written because I finally read Venom and Vow by A.M. McLemore and Elliot McLemore. I buddy read this with my friend Paula, and even though it's been out for a while, I was gifted an e-galley from File and Friends. I also checked out the audiobook from my Library, which is read by M.W. Cartosian Wilson and Vico Ortiz. This is a queer YA fantasy story about two warring kingdoms that both believe the other is responsible for cursing the kingdom's elders to fall into an unbreakable, enchanted sleep. The two main characters are a bigender dama/assassin and a transgender prince who are constantly at each other's throats, so much so that they fail to realize that they might be contending with far more dangerous enemies. Content warnings for some experienced transphobia, dead naming, and misgendering, some descriptions of blood, injury, and violence, and depictions of experienced ableism and chronic pain. This is kind of difficult for me to review because, like I said, I've read everything from A.M. Macklemore. So many of their books are my favorites, and I have such deep respect for them as an author, but I do have to be honest and say that this book was kind of a mess. So much of it just doesn't work and never came together for me by the end. There were a lot of really compelling ideas, aspects of this fantasy world that were beautifully rendered and fascinating, but sadly I never truly felt grounded in the world itself. While the characters individually and together are very strongly characterized, a lot of their actions just don't make sense. Their motivations are incredibly murky, and more often than not, it was extremely challenging to just follow the flow and logic of the story as it progressed. Even between Paula and myself, and I think it's fair to say that we're intelligent people who are no strangers to reading all kinds of fantasy stories, we were barely able to connect the dots between one scene and the next. I will say, as a trans person, I did really appreciate the depth of trans rep in this fantasy story, which is something that we still don't often get a chance to see. And I also appreciate how both characters' disabilities were at the forefront of every single scene. It was something that they actively took into account with everything they did, and their disabilities never once faded to the background or felt like an afterthought. But besides that, there were just not many redeeming qualities to the story. Maybe if it was a duology or a trilogy, the ideas and the plot points could have had the proper space to breathe, but this was sadly a miss for me, and I could only give it 2 stars. Penultimately, as if all that wasn't enough, I listened to The Devils by Joe Abercrombie. This was another May release that came out May 13th from Tor Books. Macmillan Audio granted me access to the audiobook, which is read by Stephen Pacey. This is a brand new fantasy from Joe Abercrombie that begins with a monk named Brother Diaz who's been summoned to the Holy City where he is sure that he's going to be granted a promotion. Turns out he is granted a commendation and awarded his very own congregation, a congregation that happens to be made up of murderers, necromancers, thieves, abominations, and even monsters. Together, this ragtag group of anti-heroes are tasked with a holy mission to escort a long-lost princess back to her kingdom, and they are to accomplish this task at any cost. Content warnings for descriptions of graphic violence, injury, and blood, some descriptions of vomiting, some graphic depictions of gore and body horror, brief reference to incest, and some sexual content. It's so funny to me that the consensus from people who are obsessed with Joe Abercrombie seems to be that this book is enjoyable, but just okay. It's good, but it's not his best. And then you have people like me who rarely care to read from Joe Abercrombie who are just having the time of their lives with this. And I would definitely say that was my experience. This was a gruesomely delightful fantasy romp from start to finish. It's a fantasy adventure that's violent, gory, sometimes obscene or off color, but I found those more intense elements to be nicely balanced out by a consistently comedic voice and dark sense of humor, as well as by a strangely endearing cast of characters. I don't have a better way to describe it than just to say that it was fun to follow these characters on this absolutely bonkers quest, and to see how they're constantly being tripped up not only by their own thorny natures, but also by their innumerable enemies who are determined to thwart them. And I loved seeing the genuine sense of camaraderie that kept gradually building between them with each new mishap. And I also really appreciate the story's larger question in regards to the circular nature of morality. Not only the idea that if given a long enough period of time, what's considered moral and righteous and what's considered morally reprehensible often flip-flop with each other, but also how the question of who the devils in this particular story are is much less straightforward than you would think. The story's really exploring the transitive property of how if good people can do bad things in order to achieve good ends, then the inverse must also be true. It's about how trying to establish a moral hierarchy where good and evil are clear-cut concepts that never change and never overlap is a futile exercise, because shades shades of both exist within all of us at different times and in different contexts. So I actually appreciate what the story is doing overall, and I really love the voice and the storytelling methods employed to get that message across. While I really like that the story takes its time to wind down, and I think it ends in a good place to kick off the next book, I will say I think there were a couple of sections before the resolution that perhaps overstayed their welcome a little bit. My other main critique is something I kind of have to put a pin in for the moment to see if and how it develops in future books. But for this first book, I will say that because it's a fantasy story set in historical Europe, there are some questionable, stereotypically xenophobic beliefs espoused by the characters about Eastern cultures being conflated with quote-unquote savagery that are somewhat commented on, but I wish were deconstructed much further. There's a hint of promise that those beliefs will continue to be questioned, especially because one of the main characters is an elf whose culture is conflated with those regions and those stereotypes. So I sincerely hope those ideas are challenged much further in future books. But even with that said, this was great. The audiobook was absolutely stellar as well. I have pretty much no desire to read any of Joe Abercrombie's other series, but I would happily read another 600-page installment in this series any day of the week. I gave this 4.25 stars. And the last book I was able to squeeze in for May was my arc of The Love Club by Leo Min, which comes out on August 5th from Flatiron Books. Leo Min is the author of Beating Heart Baby, and this is their sophomore release. It's another queer YA contemporary story, but with a speculative edge. It's about a group of tight-knit childhood friends who form the Love Club, taking the first initial of each of their names. And in their freshman year, one of their friends, Elle, mysteriously disappears. Shortly after Elle's disappearance, two of the friends move away, leaving O alone with her grief and confusion. But just as her senior year is about to start, the two friends suddenly move back. Now their paths are crossing once more, and they all end up back in their childhood clubhouse, where they find a PC with a game loaded up for them to play, a game that may have been created by Elle herself and coded with each of the friends' lived experiences. If they can beat the game, they might just get answers about what truly happened to Elle and also what happened to their friendship. Content warnings for experienced racism, misogyny, and transphobia, references to off-page child abuse, suicide, and self-harm, mentions of suicide ideation, depictions of disordered eating and purging, brief references to sexual assault, harassment, and attempted rape, and depictions of alcohol abuse. Content-wise, this could not be further from Beating Heart Baby, but in terms of how this story will absolutely put your emotions through the ringer, there is very clear connective tissue between the two books in that sense. This book fucked me up pretty good. There's just no better way to say it. This plus the extended cut of the Interstellar soundtrack will absolutely fuck you up every single time. I think you can tell from the content warnings, but this story is pretty grim and goes to some very dark, bleak, intense places. It's brutal and unforgiving in some ways, but it kind of has to be in order to get where it's trying to go. This story is very openly exploring different shades of grief, grieving your childhood, grieving lost relationships, grieving a version of yourself that could have existed but no longer can. And it's also deconstructing and de-romanticizing the concept of nostalgia, which can often make the past seem much more idyllic than it actually was. That's something that O, the main character, is really grappling with throughout the story. She believes that she had this perfect friend group as a child and that ever since those friends disappeared from her life, everything's been downhill. And if she could just recapture that childhood innocence, everything would be okay. But by being forced to fight alongside her old friends while battling through these levels where all their secrets and ugly truths are laid bare in the game mechanics themselves, O is having to confront the fact that her grief and nostalgia have been shielding her from the reality that these people she once loved and maybe still does, including herself, are very far from perfect. And I think the story also has a lot to say about learning to have a healthy relationship with grief, because grief is a natural and inevitable part of life. But at what point does your grief stop being a way for you to stay connected to your past and instead starts being a force that keeps you from your own future? How do you find the balance? How do you make space for what was without losing sight of what is? And ultimately, I think this story is just a reckoning with the unrelenting cruelty of girlhood itself and all the ways that young girls are not only encouraged to destroy and tear down each other, but to destroy and tear down themselves. There's also a lot to be said here about resisting the urge to grieve the future before it even happens. Yes, life can be incredibly hard, and there's no way of knowing what's on the other side of our own survival, but that's also exactly why we should cherish the beauty and joy that does exist in our lives while we still have those things. That way, when those people and things are gone, we can say that at least we honored them and expressed our love for them in the messily complex, full-bodied way that they deserve to be honored and loved. All of that said, I do think the story is a bit overly ambitious, especially towards the end, pulling in even more characters and backstory to really drive everything home. And while I appreciate how that shows that these friends and their experiences don't exist in a vacuum, but rather within a legacy or a cycle of inherited complexities, it just ends up feeling like a bit too much in not enough space. And also the mechanics of the game, while incredibly cool, were a bit confusing at times, and I wasn't always able to visualize exactly how certain things were playing out. But even with that in mind, this was still an absolutely remarkable story. I highly recommend it, and I gave it 4 stars. So those are all the books I read in May. I was not lying when I said this was an absolutely wild month, but I would love to hear what you read in May, or if you have read or plan to read any of the books I talked about today, feel free to stop by the comments and let me know your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.